Hope you all had a good weekend. Hi to everybody in chat, Lexi and MSS30FL, and whoever else is signing in. This is what it looked like outside just a few minutes ago. Those gorgeous Texas sunsets. And like I said, the subtropical jet is driving everything in Texas right now. We can take a look at that here on the SPC 250 millibar chart. And of course we always like to verify what time we're looking at. So 18 at 0Z. No, that's last night's chart. They don't have that prepared yet, so let me just plug in the URL and see if they've got the new chart up. Nah, a lot of these agencies usually slack off, and it takes a couple of hours to get that initial chart going. But we can still look at the 12Z chart, so there we go. And you can definitely see that that jet right there, all the way from the Texas Panhandle up to Missouri, and on up to the Cleveland, Ohio area, and even up to Quebec. But I think there it tends to merge a little bit with this polar front jet moving in from the northwest. So you see that there. So you might be asking, how do I know that that's a subtropical jet? Well, for starters, we can look at the surface data and look for fronts. And before we get into that, there's not really any significant fronts over Texas. But another way we can check that out is to look at the 500 millibar chart. So this is this morning's 500 millibar chart. So do we have any jet stream action from along this line? Not really. We've got like 5 knots here in Albuquerque, 20 knots there in Topeka, and this 50 knot here at Oklahoma City, that's probably a bad data there or something going on, because the other plots are not really reflecting that. To really find the polar front jet, we have to go all the way up to Washington, into Montana, and all the way over to the Great Lakes, and it does kind of die down through this area here, but we pick it back up in the northeast. So it looks like this band up here is the polar front jet. And 500 millibars is up at about 5 kilometers, or about 18,000 feet. So we're comparing this lower part of the polar front jet with the upper tropospheric chart, the 250 millibar chart, and that's where we find the subtropical jet. So there it is. So that's a little refresher on how to find the subtropical jet. So what kind of weather do we got going on? Well, it's pretty stagnant, and that's common for September. We'll put on the surface observations here. Lots of 80s and 90s across Texas, and we get into a few upper 60s and 70s around the Memphis area. We've got some thunderstorms going on in that area. And one little weak area of thunderstorms here around San Angelo. Let me zoom in on that real quick. You remember we had tornadic storms in the Midland area yesterday. Don't quite have that today. Let's see, where's that? Got to find the radar chart. There we go. It was way over to the left. So there's the remains of that little multi-cell that was going on south of San Angelo. And I'll show you a quick radar loop of that. So it's definitely a deviant mover. It's moving to the right of the upper level flow, kind of propagating southeastward like that. And I was going to mention a little bit of history. I kind of like trying to work that in where I can. This is El Dorado, Texas. El Dorado, there's used to be a little Air Force station there. If we go to Google Earth, I can zoom in and show you that. So here's the town of El Dorado right there, and we zoom in a little further, and you find this weird structure right here. This, believe it or not, is a radar that was used for sub-launched ballistic missiles. And just to show you a little bit about that, this has the the radar coverage. The main radars that they used up north to scan into Russia during the Cold War was in England, in Greenland, and Alaska, and they all faced northward like that. And the radars kind of look like this. This is the installation in Greenland. However, once the Russians started sending out submarines, there was no coverage of that, so they had to put in a couple sites, one in Alaska, one in California, another in Massachusetts, and there was another one that they put up during the Reagan administration in El Dorado, Texas. So that's kind of a noteworthy site, and that scanned over the entire southern Pacific in case any subs were sitting south of Mexico and firing inland. So El Dorado, known for something besides that one gas station in town, I guess. But that site is long gone. Let's take a look up north. Let's see. I'm kind of lost here on the charts. Yeah, I'm going to switch over to digital atmosphere here real quick and just show you the general picture. This is the very weak weather pattern we've got going on in Texas. The reason we haven't seen those thunderstorms get really organized in the San Angelo area is because we've lost the boundary. You remember yesterday we had a northwest southeast boundary through the Midland area, and that's gone. So we've kind of redeveloped this southerly flow through the southern plains area of the Texas Panhandle down into the Concho Valley. And if you don't have a good boundary to fire storms from, it can really be difficult for them to overcome the cap and start organizing. However, we are feeding some mid-60s dew points up there. You can see that moisture supply and better moisture out. We got 70s out there in East Texas there. So let's see. Elsewhere in the country, kind of a weak frontal system moving through Montana here. See the leading edge right there. And we've got lower 60s behind that. This is not cold air at all. This is kind of typical for this time of year. Very quiet out in the northeast. Kind of mild. And then we've got this very stagnant front in the Georgia area through Atlanta, Birmingham, out to Jackson, Mississippi. So that's the remains of an old front that pushed south, lost the push of cold air, and has been kind of stagnating there. So we've been seeing a lot of showers and thunderstorms in that area. And we can pick that out on this SPC mesoanalysis sector here. Lots of showers there. Very wet pattern there. I put something in my title here about surfs up in Barrow. I don't know how many of you caught that, but this is a reference to what's going on in Alaska. Here's the last hour's chart for Alaska, and we see kind of some weak southwesterly flow, but as you go north, we pick up some strong winds gusting up to 28 knots in Barrow. There you go, 28 knots. So that's going to be about 34, 35 miles an hour. And as a result, they put up something I've never seen before. They've put up a high surf warning for the Arctic Ocean coast. And normally, you know, about 20 or 30 years ago, the coast used to be banked up pretty good with pack ice, even in the summer. But that's gone, and this is all open ocean now, so things are changing. And so we've got high seas out there in the Arctic Ocean, which is kind of unusual. And this is what the Arctic Ocean looked like about an hour or two ago. I caught this off a University of Alaska webcam. And you can see the lack of the lack of pack ice. There's a bit of bits of I don't know what you want to call it, small, tiny ice flows. That's what these white things are here. And these things are shoving up the beach inland due to the high sea conditions. So what's driving all that weird weather? Let's take a look at the polar orbiter data. If I can pull up the right one here. This is the Aqua Polar Orbiter satellite, and You can see Alaska right here. And you have to keep in mind north is this way, because that's just the way they have it set up. So let me outline Alaska for you real quick. So go down here to King Salmon and Anchorage, Juneau. Then here's the Canadian coast and the high Arctic islands right there. And Barrow is located about right here. And I don't know if you can see that storm system right here. That's a very deep baroclinic low that's been pushing through that area over the weekend. And the cold front is lined up kind of like this. And maybe a bit of a warm front like that, maybe a little further north. But that's the system. And we're getting this very strong cold air advection in the back of that. And that's characteristic of the back of these strong cold fronts. You see that very cumuliform, open cell, cumulus appearance right there. So, you know, when I see that, I start thinking unstable in the lower levels. Very strong gusty winds and showery. And that's the kind of weather they've got going on right there, just off the coast of Barrow. And I figure since we're talking about sea ice, this is the sea ice extent. Maybe I can show you a chart of the coverage today. There we go. So there's the pack ice coverage we have right now, and normally it should be what you see with this orange line. So it looks like a little bit of climate change involved here. Excuse me. Climate change is not my specialty, so I will leave the arguments to you guys and any experts that are on, but we can definitely see it here on the meteorological products. And this is a graph that shows aerial ice extent during this year. So the blue line is right here. That represents this year. And the second standard deviation line is located from here. There's the bottom part, there's the top part. So 95% of the time we see this much aerial extent of sea ice. And we're pretty far below that, so this is kind of an outlier. Is that climate change, or is that just a abnormal year? I don't know. That's the big debate right now. It probably is climate change, but as for whether this is going to be a continuing thing, I guess we shall see. This is a upper level chart. We'll take one more look at Arctic conditions. This is from Canada. This is the Canadian 250 millibar analysis for about noon today. And so you can see the big polar vortex up north. And this is about the usual spot during September, kind of sitting over Greenland and maybe part of the Arctic Ocean. And that's because most of the very thick, dense ice coverage is in Greenland and just off the coast of Ellesmere Island and north of these high Arctic Ocean islands. This is where most of the ice is found. So that generates a lot of the cold air, and we see that reflected aloft as a large polar vortex kind of centered on that area. And spiraling around that polar vortex, there's a upper level low right there, and that's associated with that system that I just showed you. So this is a cold core system, and you can see that that's just north of Barrow right here. So very cold conditions aloft, and we know what happens when we see that on the Great Plains. Very cold core low aloft. That usually means cold core thunderstorms because it's very unstable. And so that's going to be behind the surface front, which is going to be running something like that, and the main low is going to be right there. So that's a little bit of an exotic look at stuff up north. And we'll return down south to see what's happening. Down to the tropics, completely different change here. There's Carl still out there. I guess that's recurving north. And here's the new system coming off the African coast near Cape Verde that could end up in the Caribbean, and I'm going to show you something shortly about that. And there's the remains of Julia coming on shore in the Carolinas. So what are we looking at for the forecast? I'll bring up the usual precipitable water and pressure, and let me get this centered since we've been moving the browser around. Maybe I'll set this up so you can read the date down here. Okay, so we start out with a deep low pressure area in Manitoba. And there's going to be a cold front associated with that. We saw that on the surface chart, running something like that with a lee side trough down through the Dakotas into Colorado, like that. And that's being driven by high pressure way out in the Pacific, way out here. And there's a ridge of that extending inland into Oregon and Washington. And then we've got a very weak Bermuda high. You can see a little bit of a extension of that into the east coast. But the gradient across the southern U.S. is very weak. And that's the reason that frontal system in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama is just kind of sitting there. And also when we have these weak Bermuda lows, we tend to get a lot more recurvature of storms out in the Atlantic. So we're seeing that one system. I guess I forgot the name of it, one coming on shore in the Carolinas and another system coming up into the Long Island area, and that's leaving the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico pretty quiet. Not really even any significant easterly waves. So over the next week, let's see, heading into the work week, Tuesday and Wednesday, that system moves into the Hudson Valley from the Canadian prairies. And we see it right there. It looks like the cold front moves in through the east U.S., through New England, and pretty much goes out of the picture except for Quebec. And we get this kind of weak low pressure still in its wake. So not much change to the pattern here in Texas. And then we have another high moving down towards Thursday and Friday, and you can see a new front developing there, east-west, through the Dakotas. And then by the weekend, storm system starting to take shape in South Dakota right there. So there's the frontal system and the flow of cool polar air coming in from the northeast right there. And it looks like the moisture does increase in Texas. With that southerly flow, we're starting to tap a little bit of the deeper moisture down in the western Gulf of Mexico. So precip chances will probably come up a little bit. Okay, then not a whole lot of change. We just filter in some cool air in the northern plains around the start of next week, so about 7 or 8 days out. And then the big change that I'm seeing here is going to be this next Pacific system coming on shore. And then we start generating some polar air up to the north. You see that air mass right here? That's a change, and that's going to drive southward. So another shot of fresh polar air. Texas stays under the southerly flow here, but look what's coming up from the southeast. It's like a possible hurricane moving through the Caribbean and towards Jamaica. So this is going to be around October 3rd, so this is pretty far out there. And then by October 4th, it's got it into the Gulf. So, of course, I always say that a lot can change between now and then, but that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on for later, because that could bring our activity up for tropical weather in the Gulf of Mexico, which we normally have this time of year. Okay, I think that's about all I got for today, and I'll just leave you with that. And let's see. Okay, let me check on chat real quick and see if there's any issues here. We had one subscriber who's been to the paved pause on Cape Cod. Pretty cool. And no complaints about the audio, so I think that's looking good and great. I'm happy about that. Anyway, I will see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and thank you for watching.